There is a growing tendency to think of man as a rational thinking being, which is absurd.
The little rover known as Opportunity
gave details of what she'd witnessed when she saw her first severed head in a bin, Shamima Begum.
might once have supported life.
The jihadi brides of Islamic State fighters.
Going to give birth imminently.
Well, we're talking about a child who was groomed.
She's desperate to get back to the UK. She's 9 months pregnant. Oh no, she's an indoctrinated ISIS bride.
This is the What and the Why podcast for the week ending the 15th of February 2019.
Welcome to the What and Why podcast, in which we ask, Shamima Begum did what? So why does she want to come home? You don't get any of that from the Opportunity space rover on Mars. No, it's made its way out there and is staying. Also, digital sovereignty. Last week's podcast this week. Brexit already seems to have resulted in a shortage of spam and facts. So welcome. And welcome...
David Waywell.
David Wherewithal.
Yeah, don't.
Greetings. Your week, David?
Yeah, let's just move on. It's been one of them weeks this week. I've seemed to have worked a hell of a lot for absolutely no reward, so I'm putting it behind me.
Life comes at you fast. Speaking of which...
I'm gonna hide if she don't leave me alone. I'm gonna run away. Don't. 'Cause you can never go home anymore. Listen. Does this sound familiar? You wake up every morning, go to school every day.
And then one day you go off to Syria and join ISIS and get married, as you do. It's all very odd, isn't it?
It's a really weird story. But it's a weird story, but it's also kind of polarising everybody.
Yeah, well, let's come to see if you and I are polarised. To the background, a British schoolgirl who went to Syria to join ISIS says she does not regret it, but wants to return to the UK to give birth. Shamima Begum vanished from her home in Bethnal Green 4 years ago. That's in London. Found by the Times newspaper in a refugee camp in Syria. Heavily pregnant, due to give birth any day. And a couple of the key quotes. She told the Times, "I'm not the same silly little 15-year-old schoolgirl who ran away from Bethnal Green 4 years ago, and I don't regret coming here." She goes on, "I am scared this baby is going to get sick in this camp, and that's why I want to get back to Britain, because I know my baby will be looked after." So, David, I mean, the one question that everyone's debating is, should she be allowed to come home?
Oh, it's such a tough one because it stinks of hypocrisy, doesn't it? I mean, the hypocrisy of running off to join this fundamentalist group who wanted to bring down the very civilization that now she wants to embrace her and help raise her children. So there is so much hypocrisy involved. It's hard to take a side. Yet at the same time, do you really want to take the side of people who are kind of using this as a signalling, the nationalist argument?
You're the Secretary of State, David. You're the Secretary of State. You've got the decision to make. Is she coming home?
Well, I think I find it very hard to say yes, but I think I think there are legal. We are a nation of laws, aren't we? We are a nation of rules, and I think as long as we abide by those rules and abide by those laws, then the difficult questions should really be taken out of our hands. So if
there's a legal side to this, and then there's a moral side to this. Yeah. Okay.
It's a whole difference between ethics.
I'm pretty much where you are.
Yeah,
I'm where you are. I bear no torch for this young lady. That was my second thought as well. The absolute hypocrisy. She clearly loathes everything about us and our system and our ways of life. She clearly embraces a completely different way of life, and yet, you know what? I want to come home and have my baby here. Despite all that, I'm with you that because the fallback position, I think you cannot get past the fact she was 15 when she went. She was a minor. To our knowledge, she has not committed any terrorist crimes. So,
well, I was thinking about this the other day. I was trying to think: is there a way of thinking about the problem a little bit more rationally? And if you strip out that ISIS angle and think about Well, if this was a 15-year-old girl who'd had had a relationship with a 21-year-old, we would accept that the 21-year-old had broken a law, but there would also be some leniency there because we're in that very, very grey area of 15 years and 11 months, 15 years and 10 months. You understand? There's a kind of like I say, it's a difference between like the absolute laws and the fact that we are flexible and we can allow some kind of moral leniency, some leniency because we understand the moral complexity and the grey area. So I think the difficulty here is ISIS and that whole, the Manchester terror attacks. Everything makes everybody extremely sensitive to the subject, and I think in a way...
Yes, and most people, in the last poll I saw, 76% of people said no way should she be allowed back here. So you and I are certainly a minority according to that poll, and I suspect we're in a minority over in general.
But I think this is the whole argument against... this is actually the argument that Burke made against... referendums. He said, we are a representative democracy. You vote your MP in order to go to London and to have make rational arguments and to base things on the knowledge, not simply to reflect a popularist feeling at the time. So well,
and also, as well as a political decision, it's also a legal decision.
Exactly.
I'll come on to that in a minute. But I do think she's sort of channeling Jarvis Cocker from Pulp. And you remember the lyric, what was it, in Sorted for Ease and Whiz? Mother, I want to go home, but I seem to have left an important part of my brain somewhere in a field in Syria. All right. I mean, I've got very little sympathy for her, despite she was a minor. But she's been indoctrinated. She's been over there for 4 years being indoctrinated. Yeah. I mean, you've almost certainly read the quote about she saw the beheaded head in the basket. It didn't really faze her. I mean, I do think she has drunk deeply from the well of she doesn't like people that don't adhere to her version.
I think this feeds into a larger narrative as well, because I noticed somebody on Twitter made an interesting point and said, if this had been a white English girl from, say, Hertfordshire who'd got indoctrinated, would we feel different about it? And I think it's feeding into this feeling in the country where there's a lot of people who feel like minorities aren't integrating into our culture quite like we should or would want them to. And there's a sense of us and them, even when the them are actually us, if you understand.
No, I think that's a brilliant point, David, because, if she was a 15-year-old white girl from a Christian heritage who'd somehow got caught up in some weird, nutty cult, gone off to Jonestown in South America or whatever, and now wanted to come back, I wonder, would the discussion be quite the same on the politics and the legality of it? Anyone who returns to the UK after travelling to IS territory does face a criminal investigation. That is going to happen, and she may face prosecution for things that we don't know about. The intelligence services, no doubt, are looking at this. Now, there is the power for a temporary exclusion order. I've been looking this up. It comes under the 2015 Counter-Terrorism Act, and it requires an individual not to return to the UK unless a permit to return is issued by the Secretary of State. Now, I think that's probably Foreign Affairs. It could be the Home Secretary. I'm not sure, which doesn't really matter. And the condition A is that the Secretary of State reasonably suspects that the individual is or has been involved in terrorism-related activity outside the UK. I think if the Secretary of State or the government takes a view that they want to have a temporary exclusion order, I think condition A could be argued has been met.
Yeah, what surprised me, I was thinking, she's actually not making it easy for herself, is she? There's something that stinks about this, in the sense that if you had gone through what she's gone through, you would be saying, I regret coming here, ISIS was terribly cruel, I realise Britain's a great country, I just want to come home to my family. She's not actually said that, which makes you think, well...
No. Quite the opposite. She said, I wanted a caliphate and an ISIS, but this lot weren't quite good enough. She wanted them to be even
purer,
more. Yes. Hang on. Condition B: the Secretary of State reasonably considers it is necessary for purposes connected with protecting members of the public for a temporary exclusion order. That would be harder. They'd have to put up the idea that she would commit acts here. But condition A, about that she's been involved in terrorism-related activity. So, and I didn't realise that it was 2 years is the period that you can be temporarily excluded from the government, during which time your passport is invalid. So, if this government's going to take a hard line, she could be not allowed to come home.
Yeah, like I say, the problem here is like you say, there's a legal issue, there's a moral issue, and then there's a broader cultural issue, which is to do with the public mood, to do with Brexit, to do with immigration, to do with integration, to do with, you know, places like Oldham and the rise of the far right and grooming gangs. This is a huge story, which is sort of, you know, the focus is suddenly on this one individual who seems to, you know, it's bringing out the best and the worst in all of us, I think.
Yeah. On the stripping of citizenship, that is not possible. As far as it's known, she only holds one citizenship, and it's British. And you can only strip citizenship if somebody has dual citizenship, and she doesn't. So that's not in the mix. This one's going to run and run for until the decision is made, I think. And again, you and I seem to be falling down into our cuddly liberal background, that we actually think.
I just think the law. You have to have the law. If you don't,
she's 15.
Yeah, you have to have the law.
Was
you
15.
have to have the law, and if you don't have the law, what are we? We're a rabble. So
you don't have to like her. You don't have to have much sympathy for her. As you say, she ain't exactly doing much for her own case with her comments. But there's her, there's the kid, there's the law. She was 15. Now she's 19. If she comes back and does anything else, lock her up and throw away the key. Who cares?
I agree.
And on that
cheerful note,
deeply liberal note, yes, I thought I'd put a bit of a gap between the other news story and just go for things we lost in the mire. Stuff I reckon is quite significant, which didn't get that much coverage. The UK will send its aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, to the Pacific next year, and this follows the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson calling on Western allies to prepare to defend their interests by using hard power. That's things that go bang. Now, this comes as the United States steps up freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to challenge China's territorial claims in the area. So Williamson's comments are really interesting. It says that the UK is going to follow that US example. Now it's got its aircraft carrier back. It's going to be using it. How that fits with a UK-China trade relations post-Brexit, that's another matter. Second of three, a suicide bomber in Iran's Baluchistan region attacked a bus carrying Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 27 dead. Now, a Sunni militant group inside Iran, Jaish al-Adl, claims responsibility. Tehran blames the Americans and the Israelis, as they always do. Russia's lower house of parliament has approved a bill which will increase government control over the country's internet. It's called the Sovereign Internet Bill. I was going to ask you about this one, David. It calls for Russian web traffic and data to be rerouted through points controlled only by the state. And it creates a domestic name system, so it allows the internet to continue inside Russia, even when they cut off all outside infrastructure coming in. They're also going to temporarily disconnect from the global internet sometime before April the 1st to test their defences against cyber attacks. So you can understand why a country might want to disconnect, a few hours. Let's just see if we're in a state of national emergency not to have outside net coming in. But what about this? All traffic is routed through points controlled by the state. I think that's a vision of the future.
Well, I agree. I mean, it's a clever move because it's kind of hiding an authoritarian sort of ambition behind a pragmatic attitude towards maintaining the internet in the case of hostilities. I mean, if data is going to be the place of future warfare, then it's in the very same way that we have to have energy security and we have to protect our oil supplies and make sure that we're not reliant on other people, then surely we have to think the same way about our data, because a lot of data these days is stored on Amazon servers. Amazon Web Services, I think, is one of the biggest suppliers of website space and bandwidth and whatever, and this podcast might be hosted in California. Might live on a server there. in the case of, hostilities, or if Trump wants to decide, he's going to hold Europe to ransom or us to ransom because he wants something, could easily cut off our access to our own data. So it does kind of make sense, but, you're getting down that kind of Great Wall of China, aren't you? Great Firewall of China route.
Yeah, well, the Chinese openly say they want digital sovereignty. They believe there should be a Chinese internet, a Russian internet, a British internet. They do not believe in the worldwide web being open. They want it divided into different bits. And the Russians have learned, I think, from the Chinese. But I do think it is a template for the future. Now, the Russians are doing it for these two reasons. Yes, one, they do want the ability in the state of national emergency to cut off outside powers being able to get into the Russian system. And without any question, the Americans and probably the British do cyber attacks into Russia, just as they do into the UK. So you can understand that from a defensive nature. But I think this is more about controlling the Russian people. And all authoritarian states are going to go down that route, I think, and possibly democracy.
Yeah, well, I would say actually that I think, a lot of people talk about the state of the Russian military not being a match for the West or specifically America. But when it comes to matters cyber, Russia, I think, is far ahead of us. I mean, I'm one of the people who I do think that Russian misinformation campaigns, Russian use of Twitter, social media, I do think it heavily influenced Brexit. I think it influenced Trump. I think I'm
less convinced. I agree they tried, and there might have been some influence, but I don't think they heavily.
That's I don't think you need to have much influence in order to have an effect, and that's, I think, the key point about. What they realise is that it's the same. I mean, we talk about spam jokingly every week about the fact that these people send out these ridiculous emails, and only a small percentage of them, they only need to have 1 in a million work, and they've made 10,000 quid.
Oh, yeah, no, on that I agree, because I make this argument. In fact, I was at a private talk the other night, and one of the many, so I'm not going to say who, one of the many former heads of MI6 was present, and we had a long conversation because he thought I was overestimating the influence of the Russian cyber bots, etc., and also the influence of things like Russia Today. But my point is that you have to put them all together.
Exactly.
And if one of them's got 0.2% influence and one of them's got 1% influence, you put the whole thing together and you have a degree of influence. I mean, we agree to disagree, but it was agreed that this is.
I think it's a matter of perspective. You see, when I say I think it's had an influence, I think the influence is a small influence, but I think it's a significant influence. This is the way that misinformation works. I mean, one of the perfect examples at the moment is Rupley. They're constantly stoking the fires around the Yellow Jackets in France.
Yes.
The video footage of that is incessant.
Yeah, for those that don't know, Rupley, it's Ruptly, yeah. And it's a website which clearly has a fairly clear agenda, and it's all part of it. Okay, moving on to the final frontier. Recognise that?
Oh God! To film? No, go on.
Yes, yeah. Wall-E.
Wall-E, that's it. I knew it was Wall-E.
Who didn't actually leave home, did he? He was left behind on Earth to clear up while everyone else buggered off to places like Mars. Which brings us to the next story. See how I did that?
Nicely done.
Thank you. So, farewell, Opportunity. 15 years into a 90-day mission. Hey, good going, guy. The solar-powered Mars rover seems to have finally said goodnight, Irene, to NASA. It hasn't been responding to NASA, which has declared mission complete, and amid tears from the staff in the California headquarters. Apparently, there were people weeping when they finally said, "Okay, that's it. We're not going to be talking anymore." Among many scientific achievements, Opportunity found evidence in 2004 that salty water once flowed on the surface of Mars. John Callas was the project manager. He says, you develop a special bond. They become your children. Even though it's a machine and we're saying goodbye, it's very hard and very poignant, which is why I put in the Wall-E, because he was a kind of cute little thing that we all felt very warm towards. David, you would wanted to do this story. I suspect you are what's that word when you make things human,
anthropomorphize or whatever. Yeah.
It's not. It's yeah. Well, that thing where you think an animal's a human. Yeah.
No, I'm not one of them, but I have followed Spirit and Opportunity for like 15 years, and I do have a certain emotional attachment to them. But I also think the story is a really significant one because everybody. I've just written a piece which is I think going to appear tomorrow about how everybody celebrates man's landing on the moon, but actually the Mars rovers in many ways are more significant because they represent the future of space exploration because we landed on the moon, but how many people? Was it 12 people eventually stood on the moon? It was only 5 missions more which visited the moon. It wasn't an omen of like greater things to come. But
yes, it was.
I don't think it was. I mean, we've never been
if we'd
back.
not gone there, we probably wouldn't be on Mars now. It's a stepping stone.
It was a response to Russia's advances in space technology, and it was a response to Gagarin really when Kennedy said we're going to put a man on the moon. But
correct.
Nixon afterwards said we're going to now focus our attention on more reasonable things, and we're not going to try to make these huge leaps. And he had a more pragmatic and rational attitude towards space exploration. But then that became the shuttle, which was another huge disaster because not just literal disasters, it was hugely expensive, too complicated. So the beauty of the Mars rovers is we have returned to a simpler way of doing our science using available technology, and we're having greater success because of it.
The word is anthropomorphic, and I think you are underestimating the human element of putting a human being on a planet. If you really think that this is more important, the psychological impact of Armstrong setting that foot there.
Yeah, no. Now, the psychological impact, yes, I agree, because there was a lot of people inspired by that to go into the sciences and to go into engineering. I totally agree with that. But actually, as a step, we didn't really proceed because we came back to doing, work in orbit, space station stuff. I
think you're underestimating those silver foil blankets that they put on people after marathons because apparently that's space technology.
Yeah, as well as the what's the stuff you put in your frying pan to stop it? The stuff.
Oh yeah, we call it non-stick down here.
Whatever. Teflon. Yeah. No, I'm not underestimating. I'm a huge space geek, and I love everything about the moon landing. But I've always loved the Mars rovers. I think.
Well, you are going to love this week's facts, which aren't coming up yet.
Yeah, because we're going to do Ask Tim, haven't we?
We'll come to that after this. Just to because you're the space geek. NASA retains a presence on Mars. The larger nuclear-powered Curiosity. Yes, that one. Well, that's been roaming the planet since 2012. And in November, a stationary robot called...
Oh, go on, Tom.
Call yourself a Mars expert. It's called Mars Insight. It arrived in November to begin exploring the planet's interior. And the next large rover that's going to go there is called...
Oh, I can't tell you that. But...
God dear me. Mars 2020. And it's scheduled to launch next summer. The 2,300-pound craft will also carry a drill to collect rock samples. I've been asking you a lot of questions. Apparently, it's now time to ask Tim.
Yeah. Well, insert a piece of music here.
Yeah, well, I thought last week's was a moment of genius.
I don't think I can replicate that.
Okay, Matt has written in.
Go on.
Matt, thank you. He says, I'll not begin with any pleasantries about how great the podcast is or how partisan David is, because we all know none of us is interested in that.
Yeah.
So, Matt, thank you for entering into the spirit of the What and the Why. Absolutely. I'm not fussed about David's week. I just ask him every week out of politeness. Anyway, he says, what do you make of Macron's statesmanship in light of the withdrawal of the French ambassador from Italy? Best Matt. It's a good question because it's one of those things that, again, didn't make much headlines, but France withdrew its ambassador from Italy. And then you think, blimey, the last time that happened was 1940. The reason was that the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy had met with some French Yellow Vest activists, and that is a bit of a slap, given that, you know, they are busy pretty much trying to dismantle the Macron government. Well, he's on his way back now, the ambassador. They've managed to get over it. It was only 10 days or something. But what do I make of his statesmanship? I don't think he had that much choice. This was such a slap in the face to the head of state of France that he had to do something. And on the scale of going to war or doing nothing, this was at the lower end. The reason he took it so seriously was also because these yellow vests that the Italian Deputy Prime Minister met, some of them are actually going to stand in the May elections for the European Parliament. Now, Macron is betting an awful lot of his political capital on these May elections. He's saying, right, this is the time we're going to smash the far right and we're going to see them back into the retreat. Now, I don't think they are in retreat, and I think they may even end up as the biggest bloc in Parliament. So he had to be seen to do something and to move against that action. But what it really does is shows us how fractured the EU is at the moment.
Yeah, and I think the fact he met them, didn't he meet the Deputy PM, met him in France, near Paris?
I mean, you know, that's...
I mean, imagine like a French, you know, Deputy Prime Minister coming over to England and meeting Tommy Robinson outside London. I mean...
Yeah, similar. Right, another one. Dear Mr. Marshall and Mr. Hayward.
Yeah. Gets better, this one. I think I'm being trolled down to here.
I'm not sure, because this was very nice young man called George, and thank you for your email, George. He starts out by saying Mr. Hayward, but he ends up calling you Mr. Wayward.
Mr. Wayward, talk about a Freudian.
I think that really ought to be your name from now on. Anyway,
Mr. Wayward.
I'm an avid listener of your podcast.
That's why I emphasised my name at the beginning.
And I look forward to it every week. Mr. Marshall, big admirer of your books. Thank you. You developed my knowledge as a young person, finding international relations interesting. And thank you, because that is really, you know, high praise if it comes from a student. I've had a few students that have said they've actually gone on to study international relations after reading one of my books, which, you know, is humbling. Apologies to Mr. Wayward, as I have not yet introduced myself to his work.
I've not inspired anybody into the field of humour.
Well, I would recommend, George, that you get hold of a copy of The Secret Lives of Monks, From Atheism to the Zombie Apocalypse, by one David Wayward. No, Waywell, sorry. Anyway, he asks for suggestions for the geopolitical forecast for the coming year. David, could you put up a link to the year forecast we did on the website?
Oh, yeah. You do it every year, don't you?
Yeah, that should get past that. The gloating of Leeds on the podcast is most distasteful, I might add, especially for listeners that might support Ipswich Town, at which point you need to point out that Leeds are back top of the league.
I was about to do that.
Yeah, and that Norwich beat Ipswich last week, which I'm sorry to say I didn't want to happen.
I was going to say, it's funny how we did mention Leeds last week when you weren't top of the table.
We were joint top at that point.
Oh, well, Liverpool's no longer top, so, you know.
Yeah. Kind regards, George. Thank you, George. Spam, well, this is proof that Brexit is already causing shortages, because I don't have any spam email to read out this week, do you?
Only one from somebody calling me Mr. Wayward.
That was an honest mistake.
Yeah,
nice young man. Anyway, last week's podcast this week. Yeah, you mentioned that the first record of roller skates was in 1760. So I couldn't help but that piqued my interest. The inventor was John Joseph Merlin, and he was a bit of a wizard on the skates. Eventually. But he tried them out first time at a masquerade party in London. So allegedly, this is the first time in the world that anyone has ever been on roller skates, 1760. His idea was that he would suavely skate into the salon while simultaneously playing a violin. Unfortunately, the skates weren't engineered for turning. He ended up crashing into a large mirror and suffering serious physical injuries, which, almost 300 years on, is quite funny, although perhaps not so much at the time. Now, David, it's that time. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm holding on
for
to
this week's facts. get much better than that, does it?
I was about to say I approve of that one.
Do you know where it's from?
Good. It sounds like that. What was that song from years ago? Button something down Joe.
No, it's from Das Boot, the film.
Yeah. Chicken edition.
Now, do you know what this week's facts are about?
Chickens.
Close. Mars. Well, because of the story, because you're
telling me there's not thousands of films made about Mars which don't have suitably Martian, alarms and sirens. Yet you chose chickens.
That was just an alarm. Anyway, look, you're going to like this. In fact, it's also a quiz. Do you know what colour sunsets are on Mars?
Grey.
Blue.
Oh, the blue. Yeah, blue.
I didn't know that. Mars is the second.
I knew they weren't red.
So, yeah, which I would have assumed they are, but the red planet. But sunsets in Mars are blue. Mars is the second smallest planet in the solar system after Mercury, and it's also the fourth planet from the Sun. How many moons does Mars have, David?
I would have said it has none.
It has two.
Does it?
Phobos and Deimos.
Oh God, I'm not great on the
Olympus Mons, the tallest mountain in the solar system, is on Mars.
Yeah.
It's 3 times the height of Everest. When the ancient Babylonians first created the week and divided it into 7 days, they named each day of the week upon the 7 known bodies in the sky: the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. Which makes me less impressed by the next one. Galilei observed Mars in 1609 with a basic telescope. Well, if the Babylonians had done it like 2,500 years ago with a naked eye, I'm not that impressed.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go on. I'm not sure what it's all to do with. I think you can see Mars with the naked eye, but you can't actually resolve any detail on it. Because it's like the people who first viewed Mars through telescopes thought they had canals, didn't they? The famous canals of Mars.
Yes.
Yeah.
The first interaction with Mars was Mariner 4 in 1965, which flew past. Many Hollywood films have been made with Mars as the subject. For example, and you have to tell me if you've seen them, The Martian.
Yeah, it's good, that one.
Yeah, I liked
Based on the Andy Weir book, yeah.
2015. 2008, Doom.
It's not so good. Not as good as the game.
2005, War of the Worlds.
It's not actually based on Mars, I don't think. It's the Martians come down to...
Yeah. That was the one with Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise, yeah.
And the best of any science fiction Mars film ever made. Here's a clue. Here's a clue. Any ideas?
Well, it wasn't Total Recall, which was what I was going to suggest.
Yeah, that was set on Mars, wasn't it? Well, if I said ack to you.
Oh, that's Mars Attacks.
Mars Attacks.
Again, which wasn't set on Mars, but the Martians came to Earth.
Yeah, it's the same thing. 1999.
It's not the same thing.
Wonderful film.
Yeah, it is good.
And I haven't seen this, but I might have to look it up. Lobster Man from Mars.
No.
1989.
But again, I suggest it's probably not set on Mars, but a lobster man comes from Mars.
All right, this one might be set on Mars. It's 1964. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians.
Yeah, that sounds right. Sounds reasonable.
This one definitely set on Mars. Robinson Crusoe on Mars, 1964.
I've heard of it. I've never seen it.
Yeah, I've heard of that
they
one.
They did. I think there was another one which was a bit like a Robinson Crusoe one. I think it was a Mars film. Can't remember what it was called.
War of the Worlds, 1953. Tom Crusoe. No, that's not true. Abbott and Costello Go Mars from 1953.
Yeah, at least they've gone to Mars.
Flash Gordon, Mars Attacks the World in 1938.
Yeah, again, probably not.
And the first film I can find made about Mars is A Trip to Mars, a 1910 short film. It stars a professor who uses a magical powder to float to Mars, where he encounters aggressive trees and a giant creature.
I want to see it for the aggressive trees.
Okay, 1910, A Trip to Mars. I haven't found it. If you have, I'm sure we could have an in-depth discussion about its artistic merits. I will leave you with the last fact. NASA has plans to create an Earth-independent colony on Mars by the end of 2030.
Have they? Well, I know Elon Musk reckons he's going to land somebody on in like the next 6 years, but I think it's highly unlikely.
I think it's highly unlikely, and looking at it, 11 years away. That's pushing it. Now, at this point, nearly everybody is expecting, may be expecting to play out with Life on Mars by David Bowie, but that's not going to happen. Are you going to say goodbye, David?
Oh, sorry, goodbye.
Goodbye.
The end is in sight.
The colourful phrase used by a charismatic figure.
This is the Trump shutdown.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the nations of the world.